Picture two people leaving the same office party. The first one climbs into a leased luxury SUV, the kind with the badge that makes people glance twice in the parking lot. Designer jacket, the newest phone, always the one who grabs the check at dinner without blinking. Everyone at that party would tell you without hesitation that this person is rich. The second person walks to a 10-year-old Corolla with a small dent in the bumper they've never bothered to fix. Same job title, same office. Nobody at that party would describe this person as rich. Here's the part that should stop you cold. The second person could stop working tomorrow and be fine. The first person is 3 missed paychecks away from a very different kind of night.
And today, I want to pull apart 2 words we use interchangeably that actually describe almost opposite financial realities: rich and wealthy. By the end of this video, you're going to see exactly why the person who looks the most successful in the room is so often the least financially secure, and more importantly, which one of these 2 things you're actually building. Let's start with a clean definition, because most of the confusion here comes from the fact that nobody ever draws this line clearly. Rich describes income and spending. It's the visible signal. The car, the clothes, the vacations, the dinners, the general aura of money moving through someone's life. Wealthy describes net worth. It's the invisible number, assets minus liabilities, the actual pile of resources someone has accumulated and kept. You can be rich without being wealthy. You can be wealthy without looking even remotely rich. And the 2 get confused constantly because the thing that's easy to observe, income and spending, is not the thing that actually determines someone's financial security, which is net worth.
Here's why this confusion happens so consistently, and it's worth naming directly. Income is public. You see it in real time, every day, every time someone shows up somewhere. Net worth is private. Nobody sees your brokerage statement. Nobody sees your retirement account balance when you walk into a room. So we've built an entire social instinct for judging financial success around the one variable that's actually visible: spending. While the variable that actually matters, what's left after the spending, stays completely hidden from view. It's a bit like judging how healthy someone is purely by how expensive their gym clothes look, while never once checking their actual vitals. Let's run the actual math, because this is where the distinction stops being philosophical and starts being concrete. Take 2 people earning the exact same salary, let's say $90,000 a year. The first person spends close to everything they earn, maybe saving 5%, because their lifestyle has scaled up to match every raise they've ever gotten. The second person lives closer to the way they did 5 years ago, saving 30% of that same $90,000, even though their income has grown. Run both of those patterns for 15 years. The first person, despite an identical salary the entire time, ends up with a small fraction of the net worth of the second person, because the gap between income and spending, not the income itself, is what actually compounds into real wealth. Same paycheck, 2 completely different financial outcomes. The rich-looking version of this story and the wealthy version of this story were earning the exact same amount of money the whole time.
It's worth sitting with why that gap matters so much more than the income figure itself. Money that gets spent the month it arrives does exactly one thing. It covers whatever it was spent on, and then it's gone, contributing nothing to anything beyond that single month. Money that gets saved instead does something completely different. It starts a second life the moment it lands in an account that grows, and every year that follows, it earns something on top of itself, then earns something on top of that. 2 people can have identical incomes for an entire career and produce wildly different financial outcomes, purely because one of them consistently let a portion of every paycheck start that second life, while the other one never did. There's also a scale version of this worth mentioning, because people often assume the trap only applies to modest incomes. It doesn't. A doctor or a lawyer earning $300,000 a year who spends $300,000 a year is, by the actual definition, not wealthy at all, regardless of how impressive that income looks on paper. Meanwhile, a school teacher earning $60,000 who consistently saves 20% of it for 30 years can retire with more genuine financial security than that high earner ever builds. High income makes building wealth easier because there's simply more room for a gap to exist.
but it guarantees nothing on its own. The gap is still the entire mechanism at every income level, without exception. This is where lifestyle creep becomes the actual mechanism keeping rich people from ever becoming wealthy. Every raise, every bonus, every promotion becomes an opportunity to upgrade something. The car gets nicer, the apartment gets bigger, the vacations get more frequent and more expensive. None of these individual upgrades feel unreasonable
In the moment, because each one is a proportional response to an increase in income that genuinely happened. But stacked over a decade or two, lifestyle creep means that someone's spending rises in near perfect lockstep with their earning, and the gap between the two, the only thing that actually builds wealth, never gets the chance to widen. You can earn more and more money for your entire career and still end up with almost nothing to show for it in net worth, simply because your lifestyle was always exactly one step ahead of your income, absorbing every single increase before it had a chance to become savings. What makes lifestyle creep especially difficult to notice while it's happening is that each individual step is genuinely reasonable when you compare it only to your current income. Of course you can afford a nicer car now. You got a raise. Of course a bigger apartment makes sense. Your salary supports it. Every single decision passes the test of, can I afford this? Because in isolation, you usually can. What that test never asks is the more important question. What would happen if I didn't upgrade this particular thing and let the raise become savings instead? That question almost never gets asked because there's no natural moment that prompts it. Nobody sits you down after a promotion and asks whether you'd rather bank the difference. The path of least resistance is always upgrade, and the path of least resistance is exactly what most people take year after year without ever consciously choosing it. I want to be fair to the other side of this, because there's a real social logic behind choosing to look rich even when it costs you actual wealth. Visible spending gets you something immediate: status, admiration, a certain kind of social ease, the sense of belonging in rooms where money is the unspoken entry fee. Wealth, by contrast, gets you almost nothing socially in the short term, because nobody can see it. If you're optimizing for how people perceive you right now, in this room, at this dinner, spending is a far more effective tool than saving. The problem is that this trade-off is almost never made consciously. Nobody sits down and decides, I am choosing social status over long-term financial security. It just happens gradually, one reasonable feeling purchase at a time, until years later the gap between how someone looks and what someone actually has become enormous, without a single individual decision along the way feeling like the moment that caused it. Now, let's talk about what the second person, the actually wealthy one, tends to look like, because the research on this is remarkably consistent and genuinely counterintuitive. Studies on high net worth individuals repeatedly find something
Researchers call stealth wealth, the tendency for people who have accumulated real financial resources to live in a way that dramatically understates what they actually have. They drive older cars. They live in homes well below what their assets could technically support. They shop in ways that would surprise anyone who assumed net worth and visible spending moved together. This isn't universal, obviously. There are wealthy people who spend visibly, too. But the pattern shows up over and over in the data specifically because most people who build serious wealth do it by maintaining a large, sustained gap between what they earn and what they spend. And that habit doesn't disappear once the number in the account gets big. If anything, it's the exact habit that got them there in the first place. And habits that took decades to build rarely reverse themselves just because the bank balance finally caught up.
There's a useful way to think about why this pattern is so self-reinforcing. Someone who has spent 20 years consistently underspending their income relative to what they could afford has, by that point, built an entire identity and daily rhythm around that habit. Frugality, or at least restraint, isn't a temporary phase for them. It's simply how they operate. The same way someone who has jogged every morning for 20 years doesn't need willpower to keep doing it. It's just what their mornings are. Meanwhile, someone who has spent 20 years matching their spending to their income has built the opposite rhythm, one where more money in means more money out, almost automatically. Both patterns become close to involuntary over time, which is exactly why the gap between rich and wealthy tends to widen rather than close as people move further into their careers, regardless of how much their income grows on either side. Think about what that actually means for the visible signals we use to judge people's financial standing. The leased luxury car in the parking lot is frequently a sign of someone spending right up to the edge of what they can technically afford, sometimes past it. Meanwhile, the plain, paid-off sedan next to it might belong to someone with a net worth 10 times higher. The visible signal and the actual number underneath it point in opposite directions far more often than our instincts assume, and that mismatch isn't an occasional exception. It's close to the norm. Here's the reframe I want you to sit with, because it changes how you evaluate not just other people, but your own decisions. Wealthy isn't a number you hit and then you're done. It's not a specific net worth figure where suddenly you've arrived. Wealthy is the gap between what you earn and what you spend, sustained consistently over time. That gap is the entire engine.
It's what gets invested, what compounds, what eventually becomes the difference between working because you have to and working because you want to. Someone earning $50,000 a year who maintains a real gap between income and spending is actively building wealth, slowly but genuinely. Someone earning $500,000 a year with no gap at all because their spending rose to match is not building wealth, no matter how impressive their income sounds at a dinner party. This distinction matters most at the exact moment life throws something unexpected at you, because that's when the difference between looking rich and being wealthy stops being theoretical. A job loss, a medical bill, an economic downturn, any of these hit the rich-looking, high-spending version of a person's finances immediately, because there's no buffer, no gap, nothing accumulated to absorb the shock. The same event barely registers for the wealthy version of that same income level because the gap they've maintained for years has already turned into a cushion. Two people can look completely different from the outside, one visibly more successful than the other, and have their actual financial resilience be almost inverted from what appearances would suggest. This is also where the two paths diverge most sharply in terms of actual freedom, not just security. The wealthy version of that person, the one with the sustained gap, eventually reaches a point where work becomes optional rather than mandatory, where a bad boss or a toxic workplace can be walked away from because there's a financial floor underneath them. The rich-looking version of that same income, no matter how many years pass, stays tethered to the next paycheck indefinitely because the lifestyle has always expanded to consume whatever comes in. Income can rise for decades, and this dynamic never changes on its own. Only the gap changes it, and the gap only changes if someone decides on purpose to let it. I also want to push back gently on the idea that this means you should never spend money on things that make your life better, because that's not actually the lesson here. And I don't think a life spent maximizing net worth while enjoying nothing along the way is a particularly good outcome either. The point isn't zero spending. The point is intentional spending, where the gap between your income and your outflow is a deliberate choice you're making with full information, rather than an accidental byproduct of lifestyle creep you never actually decided on. Someone who earns a lot, spends generously, and still maintains a meaningful gap is doing something completely different from someone whose spending simply absorbs every dollar that comes in without any conscious decision ever being made.
I want to leave you with. Something you can genuinely ask yourself the next time you're evaluating a financial decision. Or, honestly, evaluating how you feel about someone else's. Am I optimizing to look successful right now, in this room, to the people around me today? Or am I optimizing to actually have options later, when something in my life inevitably doesn't go according to plan? Neither answer is wrong, exactly. People are allowed to value different things, but almost nobody is honest with themselves about which one they're actually choosing in the moment. Because the rich-looking choice always feels perfectly reasonable in isolation, one purchase at a time, right up until you add up 15 years of those choices and realize which version of the two people from the parking lot you actually became. The next time you find yourself impressed by someone's visible spending, or honestly, impressed by your own, it's worth pausing on this question. Impressed by what, exactly? The car in the driveway tells you almost nothing about what's actually happening behind it.
Some of the most financially secure people you will ever meet in your life will be nearly impossible to identify by looking at them. And some of the most impressive looking people you meet will be closer to the edge than anyone in that room would ever guess. Rich is what people see. Wealthy is what's actually there. They are not the same thing, and confusing them for years at a time is one of the quietest ways an entire working life can pass without the gap that actually builds financial security ever getting the chance to form. Which one are you actually building toward? Tell me honestly in the comments, because I think most of us have never actually asked ourselves that question directly. And if this reframed how you think about the difference, subscribe, because this channel is entirely about the milestones that actually matter, not the ones that just look impressive from the outside.